Hello YouTube, Brett Sockled here. Just wanted to share with you a few thoughts on Michael Voris's most recent piece that I've watched called Heresy in the Eucharist. Voris is trying to endorse what he understands to be the Catholic view of the Eucharist, but in doing so makes at least four sort of serious mistakes, and I'd like to share those with you today. The first claim to look at is Voris's claim that Luther came up with the harebrained idea that the bread and the wine remain, and that Luther called that consubstantiation. Both of those halves of that claim are actually false. Luther doesn't come up with that idea at all. It's an idea that's familiar to Thomas Aquinas and had existed for a long time before that. And the second thing, that Luther called it consubstantiation, is also false. Luther deliberately avoided calling it consubstantiation. He had rejected transubstantiation, at least partly on the grounds that it was a product of Aristotelian philosophy. He wasn't going to use consubstantiation to replace it because it was just as much a product of that same philosophy. Luther preferred the term sacramental union. It's important to understand that in supposing that the bread and wine remained, Luther wasn't so much inventing a new opinion as following the opinion of several late medieval philosophers and theologians, starting with Scotus, Occam, up to Dai and Gabriel Biel that Luther read in his studies. They all found consubstantiation to be more philosophically satisfying, but opted for transubstantiation on the authority of the Church. Once Luther had rejected the authority of the Church on other grounds, he went on to prefer the articulation that the bread and wine remained. But of course, Luther was never dogmatic about this and says in several places in his corpus that it really doesn't matter to him whether the bread and wine remain, provided that the body and blood of Christ are present. The second claim of Voris's that I'd like to look at is the idea that transubstantiation entails the annihilation of the substances of the bread and wine. Thomas Aquinas actually considers this question in the third part of the Summa, question 75, article 3, and suggests that the bread and wine, in fact, aren't annihilated, and that would lead to numerous conceptual problems. In fact, for Thomas, it's very important that the bread and wine are precisely what become the body and blood of Christ. This actually has important connections with other aspects of systematic theology. Of course, Christianity does not believe that God scraps his original creation and goes on to create a new one independent of it, annihilating and replacing, so to speak, but rather that he reforms and transforms the old creation from within, and that this is mirrored in the Church's understanding of transubstantiation. So annihilation is actually an inaccurate way of describing what the Church believes about the change in the bread and the wine. More serious than Voris's mistakes about transubstantiation are his claims about what contemporary Protestant denominations believe. He would have us believe that every single Protestant, except maybe some Lutherans, has absolutely no sense of Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. That's simply not the case. I'd like to read you a quote, and then we can talk about it a little bit. The words and acts of Christ at the institution of the Eucharist stand at the heart of the celebration. The Eucharistic meal is the sacrament of the body and blood of Christ, the sacrament of his real presence. Christ fulfills in a variety of ways his promise to be always with his own, even to the end of the world. But Christ's mode of presence in the Eucharist is unique. Jesus said over the bread and wine of the Eucharist, "This is my body, this is my blood." What Christ declared is true, and this truth is fulfilled every time the Eucharist is celebrated. The Church confesses Christ's real, living, and active presence in the Eucharist. While Christ's real presence in the Eucharist does not depend on the faith of the individual, all agree that to discern the body and blood of Christ, faith is required. That's an agreed statement from a World Council of Churches document known as BEM, which is short for Baptism Eucharist Ministry. It was signed by virtually every major Protestant denomination and also by Catholic and Orthodox theologians. There's disputes about how accurately that represents each tradition's views, but it's impossible to square with Voris's claims that all Protestants have a purely symbolic understanding of Eucharistic presence. Talk to lots of Presbyterians, Lutherans, Anglicans, and even some more traditionally Zwinglian groups some Baptists or some independent churches, some people have a higher sacramental view than Voris is willing to allow. But certainly the mainstream Protestant groups will have a theology of real presence, going back to Martin Luther in the case of Lutherans, but also in some cases going back to John Wesley or John Calvin, who both had much more serious theologies of real presence than Ulrich Zwingli, who Luther disputed with and who is sort of the totem for, mere memorialism. The final claim of Voris's that I want to look at is his suggestion that the Jews at Capernaum in John chapter 6 understood precisely what Jesus meant. This is a very strange claim. They clearly understood Jesus to be suggesting something very much like cannibalism. Well, exactly cannibalism. They thought they would have to take bites out of his flesh or eat his corpse. There's no way they could have understood him to be suggesting that he was going to transform bread and wine into his body and blood in a sacramental way at a ritual meal, and that people would then share in the bread and wine, or what was the bread and wine. It's clear that they didn't have that context. And in fact, the tradition has rejected the idea that the Jews knew exactly what Jesus was talking about. There's even a heresy, little known, called Capharnaism, which is named after the Jews at Capernaum who misunderstood Jesus. If they understood him, there wouldn't be a heresy named after them. I want to just read you a couple quotes from St. Augustine to indicate the more traditional view. Augustine says, "The Jews therefore strove among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? They strove, and that among themselves, since they understood not, neither wished to take the bread of concord. For they who eat such bread do not strive with one another, for we being many are one bread, one body," etc., etc. I'll skip down a little bit. Later he says, "How indeed it may be eaten, and what may be the mode of eating this bread, you are ignorant of." Augustine's interpretation of John 6 is traditional. It's echoed in all the great voices of the tradition. The Jews at Capernaum didn't understand what Jesus was striving at. Neither did his disciples, by the way. The point of John 6 is not so much that the Jews understood what Jesus was asking, but that even at a time when it was impossible to understand what Jesus was asking, the disciples, especially represented by Peter at the end of the chapter, say, "You know what? We know who you are, and because we know who you are, we're going to trust that you're not leading us astray here." So a lot of people left because his words sounded crazy, but the disciples, to whom the words sounded just as crazy, stuck around with Jesus. And that's the point, not that the Jews had a precise idea of what he was going to do at the Last Supper. Obviously they didn't. I'm not super comfortable or experienced just talking off the cuff to a camera when there's no one around me. And I didn't want to just read you guys something I had written down before. No one wants to watch a guy just read a script. So I've dealt with these questions in much more detail, and if I've slipped up my words here or there, you can check out the link below to see how I deal with these questions and how I give a more traditional exegesis of John 6 in a lot more detail. If you're interested in that, just follow the link below to my blog and you can read this and you can join in our conversation there. God bless.